The wine hit the floor on purpose. Everybody in the copper kettle saw it. The slow tilt of the glass in Holt Kane's hand. The deliberate splash spreading across the worn tile. The way he set the empty glass down without once looking at the woman he'd just decided to humiliate. Faye Vossler was 54 years old. Her hands cracked from 30 years of dishwater. Her heart already weak enough that her doctor had told her to slow down. She'd carried plates through this diner since some of these men were still in diapers. And now one of them was snapping his fingers at her like she was a dog. "Clean it up," he said, and his voice didn't rise at all, which was somehow worse. Holt Kane was 37, dressed in a suit that cost more than the building, and the 3 men at his table laughed, because that's what you do when a man like Holt decides to be cruel. You laugh, or you become the next target. Nobody at that table knew what Holt Kane really was. Nobody in that diner knew the quiet man in the good suit ran half the dark money in Atlantic City. That the people who crossed him didn't get lawyers. They got missing. He was used to a room going silent the moment he wanted it silent. He was used to people kneeling. So when Faye's knees started to bend, when her trembling hand reached for the rag, nobody expected what came next, because a chair scraped hard in the back, and a young woman came out of that kitchen like the building was on fire. Delia Vossler was 28, and running on 3 hours of sleep, and 2 jobs, and a debt that was eating her alive. And she had exactly one thing left in this world that nobody had managed to take from her yet, and it was standing right there about to kneel on a dirty floor. She threw the folded napkin down on his table so hard the silverware jumped. "Did you just insult my mother?" The whole room froze. Holt Kane looked up slowly, the way a man looks up when he isn't used to being interrupted, and met the eyes of a waitress who should have been terrified and wasn't. And here's the part nobody in that diner could have predicted. The part that turned a cruel little power game into something none of them would forget. The moment she pulled her mother up off that floor and said 6 words to her, something happened to the most dangerous man in the city. The color drained from his face. The man who'd buried his own conscience years ago went pale because this poor waitress, without knowing it, had just shown him a ghost he'd spent his entire life running from. If you've ever watched someone with money treat someone without it like they were less than human, and stayed up that night wishing you'd said something, then you need to hear how this night ends. Before we go further, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this with someone who believes a person's worth has nothing to do with their bank account, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's get back to that diner, to the napkin still lying on the table, and to the question hanging in the air that Holt Kane suddenly couldn't answer. Those 6 words weren't loud at all, but everyone inside the copper kettle heard every syllable as if Delia had shouted into each person's ear. "Mom. Stand up." Not him. She slipped her hand beneath Faye's trembling elbow, lifting her mother out of that humiliating half-kneeling posture, and in that moment the room truly stopped breathing. Not with the polite kind of silence, but with the silence of animals sensing a storm about to break over them. Faye staggered upright, her hand still clenched around the wet rag, wine dripping onto the floor with a sound everyone could hear clearly, and she looked at her daughter with eyes full of gratitude and terror at once, because she understood what Delia hadn't yet had time to understand, that there were certain men you absolutely must never humiliate in front of a crowd. At Holt's table, Doyle Hartman was the first to react. He shoved his chair back and rose with the crooked smirk of a man used to letting his fists speak for him, his hand already sliding inside his jacket. And Russ Calloway rose halfway too, his eyes sweeping around the diner as if counting how many witnesses would have to be dealt with. The air thickened until it felt almost solid. Tina Brandt stood frozen behind the cash register with the desk phone in her hand, not knowing whether she should call the police or start praying. And Delia, exhausted to the point that fear had almost gone numb inside her, still stood in front of her mother like a fragile wall that nothing could move. Then the thing none of those men had expected happened. Holt Kane slowly lifted one hand from the tabletop, only a small gesture. His palm turned outward, his fingers slightly spread, and Doyle stopped at once like a dog yanked short by its chain. He slowly sat back down, confusion filling his eyes because he had never seen his boss hold him back in a situation that should have ended in blood. Russ sat down too, the 2 men glancing at each other in question, but Holt didn't look at them. He didn't even look at Faye. His eyes locked on Delia and Delia alone, in a way that Tina, whenever she told the story later, still couldn't find the right words to describe. It wasn't the stare of an insulted man calculating revenge, nor was it a look of hunger or anger. It was the look of someone who had just felt another person reach into his chest and squeeze something he had believed had been dead for a long time. He looked at the waitress standing there in her stained apron, Her hastily tied hair loosened into a few strands plastered damply to her skin, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep yet not lowered for even a second, and his lips parted as if he were about to say something, then closed again. In that breathless stretch of silence, Delia didn't step back. Her chest rose and fell with the wild pounding of her heart, and she could hear the rush of blood roaring in her ears. But she held his gaze without blinking, not because she was braver than other people, but because she was too tired of bowing her head. She had spent too many years bowing before creditors, before bosses, before life itself. Until tonight she had no bow left in her to give. Behind her, Faye whispered her daughter's name in a breaking voice, like a plea, tugging lightly at the hem of the girl's shirt. But Delia didn't move, and Holt Kane, the man whom the 3 men at his table believed could bring this entire city to its knees with a single phone call, the man who had never allowed anyone to see him falter, suddenly looked as though the floor beneath his feet had tilted by a few degrees. His face, which had been cold and flat as frozen water all evening, visibly paled. A muscle in his jaw twitched faintly, and the hand resting on the tabletop slowly tightened into a fist, then loosened again, as if he were trying to keep himself anchored in this room, instead of being dragged back to some place very far away, from a very long time ago. No one understood what was happening. Doyle and Russ only saw their boss suddenly fall silent in front of a poor little waitress, while Delia saw something flicker through his eyes that she couldn't name, something almost like pain, and in one brief second between 2 people who didn't belong to the same world, something shifted quietly, before either of them had time to realize it. It was Holt's lingering silence that finally broke loose, the last thing still holding Delia together, because she had been waiting for him to shout, waiting for him to give an order, waiting for a threat so she would have something to push back against. But he only sat there looking at her with those strange eyes, and that empty space made everything that had been pressed down inside her for months finally spill over. She took another half step toward his table, her voice not loud, but trembling with exhaustion and fury, and she began to speak, one sentence at a time, as if each word were a stone she was setting down between them. "You spilled that glass of wine on purpose," she said. "I was standing right there in the kitchen, and I saw your wrist turn. Nobody spills wine like that by accident. You did it because you wanted to watch my mother kneel down and wipe it up for you." Her hand pointed toward the puddle of wine still spreading across the tile floor, then toward her mother standing behind her, shaking, and she went on. "My mother is 54 years old. She has waited tables in this diner since the men at your table were just children. Her hands are cracked from washing dishes for 30 years, and you snapped your fingers at her the way a man snaps his fingers at an animal." Doyle started to open his mouth, but Delia didn't let him cut in. She spoke faster now, harder, more urgently. "You think because you're wearing an expensive suit, because you're sitting at the best table in this place, because these people laugh every time you act cruel, that makes you important, don't you? But do you know what I see when I look at you? I see a man who needs to humiliate an old woman washing dishes, just to feel big." The whole diner held its breath. Someone at the next table set a glass down too hard from sheer tension, and Tina hurried out from behind the counter, both hands raised as if trying to put out a fire, stammering Delia, "Honey, stop, come inside with me." But Delia could barely hear her, because by then she had gone too far past the point where she could turn back. She looked straight into Holt's eyes and said the sentence that many people in the diner would later repeat: "Money doesn't make you taller. It only lets you look down on more people." The words fell into the room like a pebble dropping onto the surface of a frozen lake, and for a moment, no one dared to breathe. Not Doyle, not Russ, because there was something in the way Holt didn't react that made even those 2 large men feel a cold prickle of fear. Delia was shaking, her voice beginning to break on the final words, not because she was afraid, but because her body had been drained dry. 3 hours of sleep each night, 2 shifts piled on top of each other, unpaid bills, all of it pressing into this one moment and pulling every last bit of strength out of her. But she still stood straight. She still stood in front of her mother, and she added in a hoarse voice, "I don't care who you are. I don't care what you can do to this diner. My mother won't kneel down and wipe up wine for you. Not tonight. Not ever." Tina finally managed to touch her shoulder, tugging gently, whispering urgently into her ear that she didn't know who that man was, that she had to stop right now. And this time, there was something in Tina's voice frightened enough to slip through the wall of Delia's anger, making her falter for a beat. Behind her, Faye began to cry without making a sound, one hand covering her mouth, because she was so proud of her daughter she could hardly breathe, and at the same time she was terrified for her. And Delia, still not taking her eyes off Holt, slowly lowered her voice until it was almost only a breath. "You want someone to kneel tonight, then it won't be my mother." Holt still didn't say a word. And it was that absolute silence of his, in the middle of a room waiting for rage to come crashing down, that sent the coldest chill down the backs of everyone who witnessed it. Holt Kane didn't answer Delia's final words, and that silence stretched on for several more seconds, until he slowly stood, so slowly that the whole room seemed to hold itself still with each movement he made, the chair sliding back without a sound because he lifted it instead of dragging it. He stood there for a moment, tall in his dark suit, but something in the way he held himself no longer resembled the man who had leisurely spilled that glass of wine only a few minutes earlier. His shoulders were strangely tense, and when he reached inside his jacket, both Tina and Faye shrank back slightly, thinking he was about to pull out something terrible. But all he took out was a stack of cash, folded neatly in half. He placed it on the table, not throwing it down hard, but not setting it down gently either, simply letting it drop from his hand, with a dull slap against the wood beside the napkin Delia had tossed there earlier. A thick stack of money worth many times more than the number on the check. Enough to pay for the meal, for the spilled wine, even for the silence of everyone who had witnessed it if he had wanted to buy that silence. But he didn't say a word about the money. Sol Brennan, the gray-haired man who had been sitting quietly at the head of the table from the beginning, immediately stood as well. And while Doyle and Russ were still staring at each other in confusion, waiting for an order that never came, Sol had read something on his boss's face that made him not dare ask a single question. Holt turned and walked toward the door, and this was the thing that everyone present that night would remember for the rest of their lives. He didn't look back at Delia. He didn't drop a threat. He didn't promise to come back and crush the diner the way powerful men often did. He simply walked away, each step even and slow, like a man who had just stepped out of a dream he hadn't wanted to wake from. As he passed the place where Delia stood, he paused for exactly half a beat, close enough that she could smell the cold trace of sandalwood drifting from his coat, and in that brief instant, his eyes swept across her face one more time, still carrying that strange, nameless look. Then he lowered his eyes first, something Sol would later swear had never happened in all the years he had served him. Holt Kane had never been the one to look away first. The glass door of the copper kettle closed behind him with a small jingling bell that sounded so absurdly out of place, and then through the glass, people saw Sol hurry after him, leaning close to say something to his boss. But Holt only shook his head once, very faintly, and kept walking toward the black car parked across the street, leaving Sol standing on the sidewalk and watching after him with the face of a man who had just witnessed something he couldn't begin to explain. Inside the diner, the silence broke all at once like a stretched cord suddenly cut, with sighs of relief, chairs scraping, murmurs beginning low and then rising louder. Someone in the corner breathed out, "My God, I thought that girl was dead for sure." An elderly woman shakily asked for her check so she could leave as quickly as possible, and 2 or 3 people pulled out their phones, as if needing to tell someone that they had just seen something impossible. Tina gripped the back of a chair, her face bloodless, muttering broken words that didn't form a sentence, while Delia remained standing exactly where she was, her hands still shaking. The feeling of triumph hadn't even had time to arrive before it was pushed aside by a vague unease, because she didn't understand. No one in the diner understood why a man like that had walked away without doing anything at all. Faye staggered forward and wrapped her arms tightly around her daughter, her shoulders trembling, her mouth whispering, "Do you know what you just did? Do you know who that man is?" And it was that shaking question from her mother, more than Holt's strange eyes, that first sent a true current of cold down Delia's spine. Faye's trembling question hung suspended in the air until Tina pulled mother and daughter into the corner of the kitchen, out of sight of the customers who still lingered, and there, beneath the yellowish light of the drink station, the shift manager poured Delia a glass of water with shaking hands that still hadn't steadied. "You really don't know?" Tina asked, her voice so low it was almost impossible to hear. "You really don't know who you just yelled at to his face?" Delia shook her head, her throat dry and raw, and Tina closed her eyes for a second, as if gathering courage before saying the name. That was Holt Kane. The name meant nothing to Delia. She gave a weary shrug and was about to say, "So what?" But the look on Tina's face stopped her, because Tina went on in a hurried whisper, saying people called him the owner of Kane Combine, saying the restaurants along this waterfront, the laundromats, the parking lots, half the money moving beneath the surface of Atlantic City somehow passed through his hands, and the foolish people who stood against him often didn't get the chance to tell anyone the story afterward. Tina didn't explain at length. She didn't need to. The way she glanced toward the glass door as if afraid someone might be listening, the way she lowered her voice each time she spoke that name, said more than any story could have. Delia dropped onto the kitchen stool, and for the first time since she had rushed out of that kitchen with her anger burning bright, her body began to react the way it should have reacted from the beginning. Her hands went ice cold. A tremor spread from her knees through the rest of her body, and the vague sense of triumph from moments before disappeared completely, giving way to a fear that arrived late but sank deep. She remembered his eyes, his silence, the way he had raised one hand to stop the large man who had been ready to pull something from inside his jacket. And now she understood what that thing inside the jacket had been, and she understood that tonight she had stood much closer to death than she had realized. Faye sat down beside her daughter, no longer crying, her face settling into something even more frightening than tears, the calm of a mother trying to calculate from which direction disaster would come and how. She gripped Delia's hand tightly and said, "Men like that don't forget, sweetheart. They don't let it go when they're humiliated in front of a crowd. I saw things like this happen when I was young. People laughed at them one day, and a few weeks later they lost everything. The diner, the house, sometimes even more than that." Delia tried to reassure her mother. She said, "He already left, Mom. He even left money. Maybe he just wants to forget this happened." But even as she spoke those words, she couldn't believe them, because she remembered that his eyes hadn't been the eyes of a man who wanted to forget. They had been the eyes of a man who had just remembered something. Tina shook her head. "A man like Holt Kane doesn't leave money out of kindness," she said. "I've worked in this business for 20 years. I've never seen him walk away from a table without someone paying a price. The fact that he left like that scares me more than if he'd lost his temper right then and there." Those words silenced all three women, and in that silence, the doorbell jingled again as the last customer left the diner. A small, ordinary sound that now seemed like a warning, making all three of them flinch and turn to look. Delia wrapped her arms around her mother, feeling the weak heart beneath her mother's blouse beating fast and frightened, and for the first time in that endless night, she wondered whether protecting her mother's dignity might be something they would both have to pay for, with a price far more costly than either of them could bear. It was nearly midnight before mother and daughter reached the apartment on the third floor of an old building a few blocks from the docks, where the stairwell always carried a faint smell of damp mold, and the hallway bulb had been flickering for months without the landlord bothering to replace it. Delia helped her mother up one step at a time, stopping at every landing so Faye could catch her breath, her hand gripping the cold iron railing, and Delia could hear her mother's wheezing breathing echo through the darkness, a sound that had become so familiar it was frightening. Once inside, the apartment had only one bedroom, which Delia had given to her mother long ago while she slept on the faded sofa in the living room. The yellow light fell over the water stains spreading across the ceiling and the stack of bills she had shoved behind the sugar canister on the kitchen shelf, envelopes she no longer had the courage to open each morning. The first thing Delia did was open the drawer of the bedside table and take out her mother's heart medication to count it, and her own heart tightened when she shook the plastic bottle and heard the sound of a few remaining pills rolling around inside, enough for about 4 more days, maybe 5 if she stretched the doses on her own the way she had done during desperate months before, even though she knew that was dangerous. The new prescription needed money, the follow-up appointment needed money, and money was the one thing that this month, like last month, and the month before that, she didn't have. She made her mother a cup of warm tea, tucked the blanket around her, then sat on the edge of the bed and watched her drift off, Faye's face in sleep loosening a little from its worried lines, and Delia told herself that no matter what happened after tonight, she still wouldn't regret refusing to let her mother kneel and wipe up wine for a man like that. Back in the living room, she didn't turn on the light. She only sat in the dark with her phone glowing in her hand, and on the screen was the message she had received 3 days ago and deliberately ignored, a blunt little message from Cyrus Tate, reminding her that the next debt payment was due, and that he wasn't the kind of man who liked to wait. That loan hadn't really been hers in the first place. It was the shadow her ex-husband had left behind when he disappeared 2 years earlier. Gathering up whatever in the house had value and leaving without a word of goodbye, leaving her only with her name listed beside his on the debt papers, and a number that kept swelling every month because of an interest rate she could never understand how anyone calculated. Every month she managed to pay part of it, but the principal barely moved at all, as if she were bailing water out of a leaking boat while the hole kept widening day by day. She worked the morning shift at a laundromat a few blocks away, then hurriedly rode her bicycle to the Copper Kettle for the evening shift. And on days like today, when the diner was crowded or short-staffed, she stayed until late at night, only to come home with numb legs and a brief sleep on the sofa before the alarm rang again at 5 o'clock in the morning. She looked out the small window where the streetlight shone in, and this time, her fear of Holt Kane slipped in among all those ordinary worries like a new weight laid onto a back already bent low, because she understood that if that man decided to punish her, she had nothing to lose in the usual sense, but she did have a mother with a weak heart sleeping in the next room, a shabby roof over their heads that was still everything the two of them had left, and those few small things were exactly the things easiest to hurt. She rested her head against the back of the sofa, closed her eyes, and in the moment before exhaustion, pulled her into a broken, restless sleep. She wondered whether a person who had nothing left but dignity to protect was rich, or the poorest soul in the world. A few blocks away, in a penthouse overlooking the whole coastline glittering with casino lights, Holt Kane wasn't sleeping either. He sat in the darkness of his study with a glass of hard liquor he hadn't touched, resting on the oak desk, his eyes fixed on the night beyond the window without truly seeing anything. The waitress's words kept coming back through his mind. Not the meaning of what she had said, but the way she had stood in front of her mother, the way she had slipped her hand beneath her mother's arm and lifted her up from the floor, and that image itself, a daughter pulling her mother out of a kneeling posture, had torn open a door inside him that he had kept sealed for nearly 30 years. He closed his eyes, and the luxurious penthouse vanished. In its place was some restaurant far back in the past, where 9-year-old Holt stood tucked behind a column, wearing old clothes his mother had washed over and over until the fabric had worn thin, watching his mother in her waitress uniform stand, with her head bowed before a man in a light-colored suit, seated among friends who were laughing. He remembered the wine spilling down. He remembered that man's finger pointing to the floor. He remembered the slurred, condescending voice ordering his mother to get down on her knees and clean it up. And what he remembered most clearly, so clearly that even after all these years it still ached sharply, was the moment his mother slowly sank to her knees, her thin shoulders trembling, her loosened hair falling forward to hide her face so no one could see that she was crying, wiping the puddle of wine from the floor amid the laughter. And little Holt, standing only a few steps away, had done nothing. He hadn't rushed out. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't pulled his mother to her feet. He had only stood there, paralyzed by fear and shame. A 9-year-old boy too small and too cowardly to save the only person in the world who loved him, and the image of his mother's bent back as she wiped that floor had become the scar that shaped everything he became afterward. His mother never truly stood up again after that night. Not physically, but in some inner place where something had broken. She lived a few more years in quiet submission and then was gone, and Holt had sworn to himself that he would never allow himself to be weak like the child standing behind that column again. He had turned helplessness into power, turned fear into the fear other people had to carry, and he had climbed through the underworld by becoming exactly the kind of man the boy he had once been had hated. That was the cruel irony the waitress had unknowingly thrown straight into his face tonight, because when he had snapped his fingers and ordered that dishwashing mother to kneel down and wipe up the wine, he hadn't realized he was reenacting the very scene that had ruined his life. He had turned into the man in the light-colored suit whom he had cursed throughout his childhood, until a daughter rushed out and did the thing 9-year-old Holt had never had the courage to do. There was a soft knock, then the study door opened, and Sol Brennan stepped in with a rare hesitation in his manner. He had been with Holt long enough to be the only living man who knew a little about his past, though he had never heard the whole story, and he stood there for a while, watching his boss sit motionless in the dark with his untouched glass of liquor. Sol didn't ask why Holt had walked away like that. He didn't ask why a poor waitress had been able to make the most powerful man in the city fall silent. He only said quietly that Doyle and Russ were waiting for orders, that they wanted to know what should be done about the diner. Holt was silent for a long time, so long that Sol thought he hadn't heard him, and then at last he spoke in a hoarse, distant voice Sol had never heard before, telling him they were not to touch that diner, not to touch anyone inside it. Sol nodded and withdrew, carrying with him the unease of a man who had just realized that something inside his boss Something everyone had believed had turned to stone long ago had cracked tonight. 3 days later, in the late afternoon when the diner was still nearly empty, that black car pulled up across the street again, and this time, when the glass door swung open with its familiar bell, both Tina and Delia froze where they stood, because the man who walked in was Holt Kane, alone, with no Doyle, no Russ, only Saul standing back outside the door like a shadow. Delia felt her heart drop for a beat, her hand tightening around the tray she was holding, and her first instinct was to step back toward the kitchen where her mother was working, to put herself between him and Faye, but Holt didn't move deeper into the diner. He stopped near the door, both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat in a strangely awkward posture, as if even he didn't know how to place himself inside this room. He looked at Delia, then looked toward the kitchen where Faye's figure could be faintly seen, then down at the floor in the exact spot where the puddle of wine had spread a few days earlier, and when he opened his mouth, his voice no longer carried the cold, condescending edge it had carried that night. It was stiff, hesitant, like some kind of language he had never learned how to speak. "I came to say that what I did that night was wrong," he said. And that much alone seemed to drain something out of him, because he stopped, his jaw tightening, then added with difficulty that her mother didn't deserve that no one deserved that. Delia stood still and didn't answer, because she had spent the past 3 days waiting for many things, waiting for someone to come smash up the diner, waiting for inspectors, waiting for a threat, but she had never prepared herself for the possibility that the man would come back to say the word sorry, and the shock of it made her more wary instead of relieved. Holt took a thick envelope from inside his coat and placed it on the nearest table, then said in that still clumsy voice that this was for her mother, for medicine, for anything she needed, that she should think of it as his way of making up, in some small part, for what he had caused. And in that very moment, when Delia saw the envelope, something inside her hardened, because she understood that he was still speaking the only language men like him knew, the language of money, and she stepped forward and pushed the envelope back toward him across the tabletop, not knocking it to the floor, only sliding it back with firm resolve. "You can't buy back my mother's dignity," she said, her voice calmer than it had been that night, but no less unyielding. "My mother doesn't need your money to feel like a human being, and if you think an envelope can erase the sight of you making an old woman kneel down to wipe up wine, then you still don't understand anything." Holt looked at the envelope that had been pushed back to him, then looked up at Delia, and something flickered through his eyes that wasn't anger, but something almost like painful recognition, as if she had just spoken aloud the very thing he feared was true. He didn't insist. He didn't pick up the envelope, and he didn't leave right away either. He simply stood there in silence for a while, and Faye had already stepped out of the kitchen to stand in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, quietly watching the man who had humiliated her now standing awkwardly in the middle of the diner like someone lost. The air in the diner thickened with a different kind of tension from that night. Not threat, but something harder to name. The collision of two people from two utterly opposing worlds seeing each other clearly for the first time. At last, Holt picked up the envelope again, slowly, and before turning toward the door, he said quietly, almost softly enough for only Delia to hear, that she was right. Then he walked out, leaving behind 2 women standing in silence, and a new question beginning to glow in Delia's heart. Why a man like that cared so much about right and wrong. Meanwhile, on the top floor of a brand-new glass building overlooking the docks, Garrett Pike stood before a scale model spread across a long table, a miniature version of the neighborhood where the Copper Kettle was located, except that in his model, that old diner and the entire row of buildings around it had disappeared, replaced by a glittering casino and resort complex bearing his name. Pike was 41 years old, dressed in a crisp, perfectly pressed white shirt, with a smile always resting on his lips, and a smooth voice, carefully trained to make people trust him. He was the kind of man the local papers called a visionary developer, the kind who appeared at charity fundraisers and ribbon-cutting ceremonies with gold-plated scissors, a public mask so clean it seemed flawless. But behind that mask, his land purchase contracts always came with sweetly worded threats. Homeowners who refused to sell suddenly found inspectors visiting again and again, their power and water cut off for vague reasons, small fires appearing in the night until they were worn down and signed the sale papers for a pitiful price. The block around the Copper Kettle was the final piece he needed before breaking ground, and most of the owners had already sold. Only a few stubborn holdouts remained. Among them, the old owner of the building the diner was renting. Sitting across from him in the leather chair was Doyle Hartman, the large man who had sat at Holt Kane's table only a few days earlier, and this was exactly the piece of information that would have changed everything if Holt had known it, because Doyle and Russ Calloway had been playing both sides for a long time, outwardly Holt's men, but quietly selling information to Pike for extra money. Doyle told Pike everything that had happened at the diner, the way a poor waitress had dared to scold Holt Kane straight to his face, and more importantly, the way Holt had walked away without doing anything, then even ordered that no one touch the diner. Pike listened with a smile that widened more and more, because to him, this wasn't a touching story. It was an opportunity, a crack in a wall he had been trying to find a way through for a long time. He poured himself a glass of liquor, turning it slowly in his hand, then said in that familiar honeyed voice that when an alpha wolf suddenly hesitated because of a dishwashing woman and her daughter, it wasn't a wolf anymore. It was an animal getting old and starting to soften, and animals like that were ready to be replaced. But there was one thing even Doyle didn't fully know, and it was that Pike's dazzling casino complex wasn't being built entirely with clean money. Most of the capital flowing into the project came from a northern crew, men who had long coveted Atlantic City territory and saw Kane Combine as the last obstacle that needed to be removed, and Pike was the spotless mask they used to launder that dirty money into concrete and shining glass towers. Swallowing Holt's block, therefore, wasn't merely a real estate deal to Pike. It was a blade that the men behind him wanted to drive into the ribs of Holt's territory, and Holt's sudden hesitation over that little diner had become the perfect signal for them to strike. Pike set down his glass, looked back at the scale model where the diner had already been erased, and told Doyle to get ready. It was time to show his old boss the price of compassion. Then he smiled the smile of a man who believed he was holding every card, never knowing that he had just wagered his own life on underestimating the man he thought had gone soft. Delia pushing the envelope back should have made Holt give up, but it did the opposite, because for the first time in many years, someone had refused his money not out of fear, but out of principle, and that both confused him and made him want to do something for her in the only way he knew how. He didn't understand the ways of ordinary people. He didn't know how to ask after someone or help a person without making a display of it. He only knew the ways of his own world, so he called Sol in and quietly ordered him to find out what the waitress was trapped in. And within a few days, Sol placed a thin file on his desk that told the whole story. The loan shark debt jointly signed with the husband who had walked away, the name Cyrus Tate, the brutal interest rate, and the fact that the next payment was already overdue. Holt finished reading, folded the file shut, and that night he went to Cyrus Tate himself. He didn't need threats. He didn't need to raise his voice. The Kane name and the cold weight of his presence were enough to make the lender go pale and sit down to sign over the entire debt. And just like that, after one brief meeting, the man holding the debt that had hung over Delia's head for 2 years was no longer Cyrus Tate, but Holt Kane. He hadn't meant for her to know. He had only wanted to quietly erase that burden as a kind of atonement that needed no thanks. But he hadn't accounted for how quickly news traveled in the cramped world of the waterfront. And only a few days later, Cyrus Tate, out of fear and a desire to wash his hands of the matter, let slip to an acquaintance that he had sold the Vossler girl's debt to Kane's people. And that news eventually reached Delia through Tina herself. When she heard it, Delia stood frozen in the kitchen, still holding a cleaning rag in her hand, and the emotion rising inside her wasn't relief, as it should have been, but fear tangled with the feeling of being violated, because she understood at once what this meant. It meant the rope tied around her had now passed from the hands of an ordinary loan shark into the hands of the most powerful man in the city, and a debt owed to a man like Holt Kane was more terrifying than any interest rate. That evening, she went to his penthouse, something she herself couldn't believe she dared to do. And when she stood before him, she couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. She asked him directly whether he had bought her debt, and when Holt gave a small nod without denying it, the words that had been choking her throat burst out. "I don't want to be saved with blood-stained money," she said. "You think you're helping me, but you're only trading one chain for another, and yours is a chain I can never afford to pay off." Holt looked at her, and this time he didn't try to justify himself, because deep down he knew she was right. He had done the wrong thing again in exactly the way he always did, using hidden power to solve something that should have been solved with something else, something he had never learned. He said quietly that he didn't need her to pay anything back, that the debt might as well no longer exist. But Delia shook her head, her eyes reddened by anger, and by an ache of humiliation she couldn't name. "You don't understand," she said. "For someone like me, a debt erased without being paid by my own hands is still a debt. It only turns into something heavier." Then she turned away, leaving Holt standing in the middle of his vast room with the bitter feeling that the harder he tried to do the right thing, the farther he pushed her away, because he was still reaching out with the hand of a man who had spent his whole life knowing only how to take and had never learned how to give. After the night, she turned her back and walked away. Those two people from two opposing worlds should have never met again. But a few days later, after the diner had closed and Delia had stayed behind to clean, Holt came again. This time he brought no envelope, no Saul, only himself, pushing the door open and stepping inside before sitting down on the stool at the counter, saying that he hadn't come to convince her to accept anything. He only wanted to sit for a while. Delia watched him warily, her hand still moving over the counter with the rag, but she didn't send him away, partly because she knew she couldn't drive away a man like him, and partly because there was something in the tired way he sat tonight that made her more curious than afraid. They sat there in the empty diner beneath the dimmed lights, and for the first time Holt spoke to her not in the voice of command, nor in the awkward voice of an apology, but in a low, slow tone. He asked about her mother, about how long she had worked in this diner, and when Delia told him her mother had stood in that kitchen for nearly 30 years, his eyes darkened for a moment, in a way she couldn't understand, but could feel. She asked him in return, a question she hadn't meant to ask, but that slipped out anyway. "Why would someone like you care whether my mother knelt or didn't kneel?" And Holt was silent for a very long time, so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said softly that there were images that, once burned into a person's eyes, never faded. And that on that night, when he saw her pull her mother to her feet, he had seen again something he had spent his whole life running from. He didn't say clearly what that thing was, and Delia didn't press him, but in that moment she saw a real crack running through the ice the man wore around himself, a brief glimpse of something wounded and deeply human, showing at the bottom of those eyes that had always seemed cold, and that glimpse unsettled her more than any threat could have, because it made her realize that he wasn't entirely the monster the whole city feared. A silence stretched between them. Not a heavy silence, but a strange kind of tension, like an invisible string trembling softly between them, and Delia became sharply aware of the small distance between her hand resting on the counter and his, sharply aware of the way his gaze lingered on her face longer than it should have. And she warned herself that the feeling beginning to glow inside her chest was dangerous, more dangerous than fear itself, because a woman like her had no right to let her heart tremble for a man whose hands had been stained by things she didn't even dare imagine. She stood first, holding on to the excuse that she had to go home to her mother, and Holt stood as well. But before he reached the door, he stopped, looked at her, and said something that left her motionless, that in this entire city, she was the first person in many years who had dared to look straight into his eyes without begging from him or fearing him, and he didn't know what to do with that. Delia didn't answer, because she didn't know what to do with the contradiction tearing through her either, wanting him to leave so she could be safe again inside her old world, while secretly wishing he would stay just a little longer. And when the glass door closed behind him with that familiar bell, she stood alone in the empty diner for a very long time. One hand pressed to her chest where her heart was beating to a rhythm she didn't want to admit, knowing she had just crossed a line she never should have crossed. 2 nights later, at that deep late hour when the waterfront street had gone completely empty and only the diner's weak light spilled out onto the sidewalk, Faye stayed behind later than usual to prepare ingredients for the next morning's shift, while Delia was on her way back to pick up her mother after stopping home to get her medicine. So inside the diner at that moment there were only Faye and Tina, who was closing out the register at the counter. Everything happened so quickly that afterward no one could reconstruct the sequence clearly. First came the sound of a car engine revving as it slowed in front of the diner, a sound that felt wrong in the stillness of the night and made Tina lift her head with a frown. Then the car window rolled down, and the next thing came as a burst of sharp explosions tearing the night apart as bullets slammed into the front of the diner. The windows shattered into thousands of pieces that came crashing down onto the floor like a hailstorm. The metal sign reading, "The copper kettle spat, sparks as bullets struck it." Bottles on the shelves behind the counter burst one after another, and Tina screamed, throwing herself down behind the bar, dragging her whole body flat against the glass-covered floor. Faye, who had been standing near the open kitchen that connected to the dining room, only had time to glimpse the glare of headlights and the flashes of fire at the muzzle before instinct drove her to duck behind the large stainless steel refrigerator, both hands over her head, while the world around her broke apart in roaring noise and the violent clatter of glass. It all lasted only a few seconds, endless to those trapped inside but brief in truth, because this wasn't a massacre. It was a coldly calculated warning. The bullets deliberately driven high into the walls and windows instead of aimed at people, enough to sow terror without causing deaths that might bring consequences even Pike wasn't ready to face. Then the car roared away and vanished into the dark, leaving behind a silence even more terrifying than the gunfire. A silence broken only by the distant wail of some car alarm and the sound of the last shards of glass still hanging from the window frame falling to the ground. At that exact moment, Delia reached the end of the street, and from a distance, she saw the diner's front gone dark and torn open with jagged scars, saw the glass door reduced to nothing but a hollow frame, and an icy horror clamped around her throat so tightly that she dropped the bag of medicine from her hand and ran forward, screaming for her mother. She pushed through the broken doorway, stepping onto the carpet of glass that crunched beneath her shoes, her eyes wildly sweeping across the ruined diner under the flickering lights, and when she heard Tina's faint voice calling from behind the counter, she rushed over and saw the manager trembling as she crawled up, her face bloodless but her body still whole. Delia screamed for her mother again, and from the kitchen area, Faye staggered out, her body dusted with plaster and tiny glittering shards of glass on her shoulders, her face deathly pale, her lips moving without sound, and when Delia ran to her and wrapped her arms around her, she felt her mother's entire body shaking uncontrollably. In her daughter's arms, Faye tried to say something, but only broken breaths came out. One hand clutched Delia's shirt, while the other rose unconsciously to press against the center of her chest, where her already fragile heart was now beating in a terrifying, frantic rhythm after the awful shock they had just survived, and Delia, standing in the wreckage of everything her family had left, suddenly understood with a fear even greater than the gunfire itself that something was terribly wrong with her mother. Faye collapsed right in her daughter's arms amid the broken glass, one hand still pressed tightly against the center of her chest, her breath shortening into urgent gasps, and Delia screamed for Tina to get the phone and call an ambulance while she held her mother up, pressing her ear to Faye's chest and hearing the heartbeat stumble wildly and grow weaker. The minutes waiting for the ambulance stretched as long as a lifetime. Delia knelt on the ice-cold floor, gripping her mother's hand, repeating again and again, "Mom, hold on. I'm here. Don't leave me," while Faye only had enough strength left to squeeze her daughter's fingers once, lightly, like one last attempt to reassure her, before her eyes grew dull and drifted shut. When the ambulance arrived, red and blue lights swept across the diner's bullet, scarred walls in flashing waves, and the paramedics quickly placed Faye on a stretcher, fitted an oxygen mask over her face, and pushed her into the ambulance. Delia climbed in after her, not letting go of her mother's hand for even a second, while Tina remained standing amid the wreckage with a stunned, hollow face, watching them go, all the way to the hospital. And through the hours that followed, Delia sat curled on a cold plastic chair outside the emergency room, still wearing her uniform dusted with plaster and tiny glass shards, her two hands clenched together until they turned white, listening to every sound behind the double doors until the doctor finally came out and told her that Faye had survived the crisis. But her already weak heart had been driven into deeper exhaustion, and she would need strict monitoring, because even one more shock might be more than she could bear. Delia dropped her head into her hands and finally let the tears break loose, not in loud sobs, but in the silent trembling of someone who had held herself together for too long and was now completely drained. And it was in the moment when she thought she was most alone that a shadow came and sat down in the chair beside her. When she looked up, it was Holt. He had heard about the shooting within an hour, and he came not with the bearing of a crime boss, but with the quiet uncertainty of someone who didn't know whether he had any right to be there at all. He sat in silence beside her for a long while, then said softly that he was sorry, and this time those two words didn't sound awkward the way they had before. Delia, so exhausted she no longer had the strength to guard herself, asked him in a hoarse voice why did he care this much, and Holt stared into the empty space in front of him for a long time, before finally speaking aloud something he hadn't said to anyone in nearly 30 years. He told her that when he was a 9-year-old boy, his mother had also been a waitress, and one night in the restaurant where she worked, a wealthy man spilled wine and forced her to kneel down and wipe it up, while his friends laughed around him, and he, her son, stood hidden behind a column and didn't dare do anything, too small and too frightened to save his own mother. His voice didn't tremble, but there was something heavy and dark in every word. He said his mother never truly recovered after that night, that something inside her had broken and she carried it with her until she died a few years later, while he grew up with a vow that he would never be that helpless again. And in order to never be afraid, he became exactly the kind of man other people feared. Then he turned to look at Delia, and for the first time, she saw tears shining in those cold eyes. He said that night in the diner, when he snapped his fingers and ordered her mother to kneel down, he hadn't realized he was turning into the very man he had hated all his life, not until she rushed out, pulled her mother to her feet, and did the very thing he hadn't been brave enough to do when he was 9 years old. And that was why his face had gone pale, because she had forced him to look straight at the ghost he had spent his entire life running from. Delia sat listening in silence, tears still falling, but now they were a different kind of tears. And in that cold hospital hallway deep in the night, 2 wounded people from 2 worlds that should never have touched suddenly understood that they had always carried the same wound, only on opposite sides of the same spilled wine from long ago. After that confession, a long silence spread between them in the empty hallway. But it was no longer the silence of 2 strangers guarding themselves against each other. It was the silence of 2 people who had just placed between them the deepest hidden wounds of their lives. And in that moment, Delia did something even she hadn't expected. She reached out and took Holt's hand where it rested on his knee. It was a large hand, cold and rough with hard calluses whose origins she didn't dare guess. A hand that had done things she knew she shouldn't touch. But in this exhausted and fragile hour, she saw only the hand of a human being who had once been a child, hiding behind a column, helplessly watching his mother kneel, and she squeezed it gently like a thank you she couldn't speak aloud. Holt stiffened for a moment at that touch, as if it had been a very long time since anyone had touched him without fear or calculation. And then slowly, his fingers closed around hers, very lightly, as though he were afraid that if he held too tightly, he would break something rare that had just begun to exist between them. They sat like that for a long while beneath the cold white fluorescent lights, and then Delia was the one who spoke first, her voice low and filled with ache. She said she didn't know what this was, what was happening between them, but she knew it couldn't go anywhere. Holt didn't argue. He only asked why, though deep down he already knew the answer. And Delia turned to look at him, her eyes red, yet her gaze heartbreakingly clear. She said, "Your world and mine can't live under the same roof. You're a man the whole city has to fear, and I only want a life where my mother can sleep in peace without flinching every time she hears a car engine revving outside." She said that if she allowed herself to step into his world, she would have to spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, would have to grow used to the fact that the people she loved could become targets at any moment, exactly the way her mother had become one tonight, and she wasn't strong enough to carry that fear on top of all the fears already weighing down her life. Holt listened, and what made all of it hurt even more was that he didn't try to deny it, because he knew every word she said was true. He knew that the only thing he could offer a woman like her was also the very thing that would destroy her. That no matter how badly his hand wanted to shelter her, it was still the same hand that dragged an entire dangerous world along with the hem of its sleeve. He said softly that perhaps some people were born to meet each other only once, long enough to change each other forever, but not to stay beside each other. And Delia nodded, a tear rolling down her face, because she understood that he had just spoken the thing she hadn't been brave enough to say completely. They promised each other nothing. There was no word about a future, no plea for her to stay, no request from her that he change, because both of them were grown enough to know that there are some abysses feeling can't bridge, and that brutal honesty was gentler than any empty promise. At last, Delia withdrew her hand, slowly, and the space her hand left behind in Holt's palm created a coldness that all his power and money could never fill. And when she stood and turned back toward her mother, he remained sitting there alone in the hallway, understanding for the first time in his life that there were things in this world he couldn't buy, couldn't seize, and couldn't keep. Holt left the hospital when dawn was nearly breaking, and what he carried out of that cold hallway wasn't loud rage, but a focused coldness far more terrifying, because he knew exactly who was behind the bullets that night. And he understood that answering with guns was only the language Pike and the men behind him expected, a street war that would drag the police in and hurt innocent people like Faye all over again. So instead of calling Doyle or Russ, the 2 names Sol had now quietly confirmed as traitors selling information to Pike, Holt chose another path. The path he had spent his whole life building but rarely used, using his own machinery of paperwork and hidden connections to take apart Pike's empire piece by piece without firing a single shot. He had Sol gather everything, and it turned out that a man wrapped in a clean public mask like Pike had left many cracks exposed. Shell companies registered overseas, streams of money moving in circles through a series of accounts before pouring into the casino project, land purchase contracts at unusually high prices used to legitimize money from unclear sources, all of it the trail of a massive laundering machine for which Pike was only the face. Holt knew very well that the money belonged to the Northern crew, the men who had used Pike to stab into his territory, and instead of confronting them directly, he did something more subtle. He let them see how careless Pike had become, how the cracks in his files were large enough to bring down the entire network and expose the people behind him. To an underground organization, nothing was more frightening than a link that had become a liability. And once Holt skillfully dropped the right rumors into the right ears through the middle channels he controlled, the Northern crew immediately realized Pike was no longer an asset, but a ticking bomb. And they did exactly what men like them always did. They quietly drained the funding out of the project and abandoned him without mercy, leaving him alone with a half-built money-devouring project and creditors beginning to tighten their grip. At the same time, through an intermediary lawyer who could not be traced back to him, Holt had a carefully organized file delivered to a federal agent who had long been quietly investigating money laundering channels along the waterfront but had been missing the final piece. And that file was exactly the piece they needed. Clean, complete, enough to open an official investigation without a single Kane Combine fingerprint on it. Everything collapsed so quickly after that Pike had no time to react. Accounts were frozen. The casino project was suspended as a series of legal violations surfaced all at once. The partners who had once fought to shake his hand at fundraisers now avoided him like a disease. And then one morning, federal agents appeared at his luxurious glass office with an arrest warrant and led him out in broad daylight before the cameras of the very newspapers that had once praised him as a visionary developer. The takeover of the block vanished like smoke. The stubborn property owners who had held their ground breathed in relief without ever knowing who had truly saved their neighborhood, and the glittering scale model where the copper kettle had once been erased now became evidence in a federal case. Holt watched it all from a distance, with no statement, no sign of triumph, because to him, this wasn't revenge. It was the cleaning away of a danger threatening the people he had chosen to protect. And when Sol asked whether they needed to deal with Doyle and Russ as well, Holt was silent for a while before saying that traitors would sink with the ship they had chosen, and he didn't need to dirty his hands any further. They would be swept up in the same federal dragnet that was about to pull Pike under, leaving no loose ends for Kane Combine to worry about. On the night before the federal charges were officially filed, after he had finally understood who was behind the lightning-fast collapse of his world, Pike did the last thing a cornered man could think to do. He went to Holt, not for revenge, but to beg, because he knew the only person alive who still had enough power to possibly save him from both the Northern crew and the federal government was the very man he had been foolish enough to provoke. Sol led him into the study in the penthouse, and Pike stepped inside looking nothing like the smooth, confident man who had once stood before the scale model. His shirt wrinkled, his eyes shadowed, the flawless clean mask cracked open to reveal the real man underneath, a panicked opportunist. He began with offers. He said he still had connections, that he could work for Holt, that he was willing to hand over everything he knew about the Northern crew. But his voice trembled, and the more he spoke, the weaker he sounded, because he could read on Holt's stone-cold face that not one of those words carried any weight. And then, when all his words had run out, Garrett Pike did the very thing he himself had made so many others do. He slowly sank to his knees on the polished wood floor of the room, clasped his hands together, lifted his fear-twisted face toward Holt, and begged. He said, "Please, I'll do anything. Don't let them kill me. Don't let me lose everything. I'm begging you." In that moment, the whole room seemed to congeal into stillness, and Sol stood quietly by the door watching, because he understood better than anyone what this scene meant. The man who had sent bullets into the diner of a dishwashing woman, the man who had nearly killed Faye, was now kneeling at Holt Kane's feet, begging for mercy. And no one in this world could have blamed Holt if he had left that man kneeling there, or done something worse. Holt looked down at Pike on his knees before him, and for one very brief moment, a moment known only to him, that image overlapped with another from nearly 30 years earlier, the image of a thin woman sinking to her knees and wiping up wine amid laughter, and he realized with a quiet revulsion that if he enjoyed the sight before him, if he allowed himself to feel satisfied watching a human being kneel and beg for mercy, then he would be no different from the man in the light-colored suit all those years ago, no different from the very person he had just sworn he would never become again. He stood there in silence for a long time, looking at Pike. And at last he spoke, his voice low and tired, but firm. "Get up." Pike looked up in confusion, not believing his own ears, still kneeling there, and Holt repeated it again, this time more slowly, one word at a time. "Get up. I don't need anyone else to kneel. This world has already had too many people on their knees." Pike staggered to his feet, and Holt went on, saying he would not save Pike, would not stop the federal government, would not say a word to the northern crew. Pike would have to face the consequences of what he himself had planted, but he would not receive anything more from Holt's hand, because Holt had decided that from this night forward, he would no longer be the kind of man who made others kneel just to prove his power. Saul took Pike out, trembling and pale, sending him back into the night to meet the fate he had chosen for himself, while Holt remained alone by the glass window, looking down over the city, and for the first time since he had claimed control of this city, the sight of a man kneeling at his feet didn't give him a feeling of power. It left only a quiet emptiness, the emptiness of a man who had begun to understand that true strength didn't lie in forcing others down, but in allowing them to stand. The weeks that followed passed slowly and strangely peacefully, as if the whole waterfront had exhaled after a storm had gone by, though most of the people living there never even knew how close that storm had come. Faye gradually recovered, first through the long, endless days in the hospital with the heart monitor beeping steadily beside her bed. Then through the day, she was finally allowed to go home with a new prescription, and the doctor's stern warning that she absolutely had to avoid stress. And Delia, though the fear still remained whenever she remembered that night, could breathe a little easier when she saw color returning to her mother's face, and heard her grumbling that she wanted to get back to the kitchen soon. The copper kettle was repaired too. The window glass was replaced. The bullet holes in the walls were patched over, and one morning when Tina opened the diner, she found that every bit of the damage had already been quietly fixed by a crew that had come and gone without anyone sending a single bill, just as no one ever appeared to claim credit for the work, and all three women understood without needing to say aloud where it had come from. The block escaped the hand that had tried to swallow it whole. The threatening letters and strange inspectors abruptly stopped. The casino project that had once hung over them like a sentence became a thing of the past along with the name Garrett Pike, which people still sometimes mentioned in the papers beneath headlines about the widening federal investigation, and the old neighbors of that worn little district went on with their lives without ever knowing who had truly preserved them. One day, Delia received a thin envelope in the mail, and inside it wasn't money, but every document connected to the old debt, stamped paid in full, along with a small slip of paper bearing only one handwritten line saying that this debt had never been hers. It had been erased, and she owed no one anything. Not a single demand, not one reminder of who had done it, not one condition attached. Delia sat for a long time with those papers in her hands, and she understood that this was Holt's way of keeping his word, his way of giving her freedom back without binding her to him again. This time he wasn't trying to buy her or force anything on her. He had only quietly unlocked the chain and stepped back, and that stepping back was the greatest gift he could have given. She thought about him more often than she wanted to admit during the nights when she sat alone in the living room, thought about the cold, calloused hand she had held in the hospital hallway, thought about the tears shining in his eyes when he told her about his mother, and sometimes she caught herself wondering whether, in another life, in another world, things might have been different. But then, she always returned to the same clear and painful truth, that Holt Kane couldn't become an ordinary man sitting quietly at dinner in a warm kitchen. He couldn't shed the world that had made him simply because he had met her, and she herself couldn't step into that world and still keep the peace she longed for her mother and for herself. She had seen the price of that world too clearly. It was carved into the bullet-scarred front of the diner. It lived in her mother's weakened heartbeat, and no matter how deeply her heart trembled, her reason still knew that there were some abysses people shouldn't cross only because of one moment of tenderness. So she folded the papers, placed them in a drawer, and let that gentle, aching feeling settle into something she could carry without letting it drown her, a memory of a man who had stepped into her life exactly when she needed him most, and then would have to step out again. leaving her standing more firmly on her own 2 feet. A few weeks later, on a late afternoon when the sunlight had turned golden over the water and the copper kettle had just begun to empty out, the newly replaced glass door rang again with its familiar bell, and Holt Kane stepped inside. Alone, with no dark suit, no soul following behind him. Only a man in a simple coat who sat down at a small table like any ordinary customer. Delia stopped behind the counter when she saw him, but there was nothing in him now that looked like a crime boss coming to collect on a debt of gratitude. He only ordered a cup of coffee and a simple meal, eating slowly in the corner of the diner, quietly watching the warm little space he had once nearly destroyed in a moment of arrogance. When Faye came out of the kitchen, the man who had once made her kneel rose from his chair, and this time there was no condescending distance between them. He stood facing her as an equal, looked straight into her eyes, and apologized, a plain and honest apology, saying he was truly sorry for what he had done to her, that she had never deserved to endure it. And Faye, the woman who had bowed her head for an entire lifetime, stood with her back straight this time and accepted that apology without bending herself, only giving a small nod with the quiet composure of someone who understood that her dignity had never been something another person had the right to grant or take away. Before leaving, Holt placed a white card on the counter in front of Delia, with no name, no account number, no promise, only one handwritten line saying that if someday anyone tried to make her mother kneel again, she wouldn't need me, because she already knew how to stand on her own. And when Delia looked up, he had already reached the door, pausing for a moment to look at her one last time with eyes that were no longer cold, then stepping outside into the city where he belonged, leaving behind the soft ringing of the doorbell and a tender, aching silence. Delia held the card in her hand for a long time, and she understood that this was his way of saying goodbye, without holding on, without promising they would meet again, only returning her to her own life with the quiet faith that she was strong enough to protect what she loved. And perhaps that was the kindest thing a man like him had ever done for anyone. This story, from the puddle of wine spilled on the old tile floor to the white card left on the counter, isn't the story of a powerful crime boss or an unfinished love. It is a story about human dignity, about the simple truth that a person's worth is never measured by the money in their pocket or the clothes on their back, that a mother who has washed dishes for 30 years deserves to stand upright like anyone else, and that sometimes one voice brave enough to speak at the right moment is enough to force an entire room to look at itself, even to change a person who seemed hardened beyond repair. It reminds us that self-respect isn't a luxury reserved for the wealthy, that respect between one human being and another is what reveals true character, and that no one in this world is born to kneel before another person simply because that person has more money. If the story you just heard touched your heart, please press like, share this video with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel, so that every day we can listen together to more meaningful and deeply moving stories like this one. How do you feel about Delia and her mother's story? Have you ever witnessed or lived through a moment when human dignity was tested in ordinary life? And if you were in that situation, would you have enough courage to raise your voice? Please leave a comment below to share the feelings deep in your heart, because we are always eager to listen to and cherish every story, every thought you entrust to us. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very final moment. May you and the people you love always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and calm every day. And the next morning, when the sun rose again over the waterfront, the copper kettle opened its doors once more, warm light spilling onto the sidewalk, Faye standing again in her kitchen with her back straight, and Delia turning the sign on the door to welcome the first customers of a new day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next videos.